Good morning, good day, and good evening to you. Welcome to the first of 3 public special sessions in the Media Lab's Out of Lab experience, this one entitled Resilience. The Media Lab has always had a vision. It's far more than a housing for a group of researchers and students. In the early days, it was a vision for media. Now, as you'll see, it's evolved well past that. In some circles, this labels us as futurists, but we are not that. We don't predict the future, we create options. We explore possibilities. We combine vision with action. What grounds that vision, however, is interaction. Interaction with organizations that support and participate in the research, and interaction with the real world as we implement and deploy ideas. This tears us out of the comfort of the ivory tower and thrusts upon us a mantle of responsibility for what those interactions mean and how they work, not just in the world, but for the world. This week, we present 3 dimensions of that vision, what we're calling big pictures. These are the themes that bind together our thinking and hopefully align it with yours. The first of these, resilience, begins now. It's timely because resilience is what makes us strong in the face of challenge. And we've had our share of challenges recently. It's also important because until those challenges appear, it's easy to become rigid and deficient and unresilient. Let's hear what resilience means to us and to you across scales and across domains. Take it away, Kent.
Hello, I am Kent Larson, Director of the City Science Group at the MIT Media Lab, and we are here to explore resilience across scales. So the pandemic has revealed the fragility of many of the systems that we took for granted. Workplaces sit empty. Many schools, stores, and restaurants are still closed. Homes are poorly suited for remote work and education. Transit systems feel unhealthy, and many supply chains are broken. We also see depression-scale unemployment. And then climate change, a front-page topic just a few months ago, will likely create a series of additional shocks in a post-pandemic world. And the impact of all of this will fall disproportionately on the young, on the elderly, and the disadvantaged. On the other hand, there's a growing interest in building more resilient communities that can adapt and even grow stronger when faced with these inevitable challenges in the future. And there's a renewed commitment by many to address the great inequities of society. Here at the Media Lab, we plan to build a research agenda focused on increasing resilience. But before this gets delineated, I wanted to collect diverse views about what precisely do we mean by resilience. Roz Picard and I will talk about resilience at the scale of the individual. I will then talk with Lord Norman Foster about resilient cities and communities and urban infrastructure. And at the broadest scale, I'll explore possibilities for creating more resilient data, ownership, and finance systems with Sandy Pentland. This will then be followed by conversations about 3 of what I think are essentials for resilience. First, Mitch Resnick and I will discuss where we must take education in order that citizens can creatively solve whatever challenges we face in the future. I will then explore the relationship of trust and resilience with Tenzin Priyadarshi, a Buddhist monk. And finally, Deb Roy and I will talk about the future of communication and the need for more honest and constructive conversations to enable healthy and vibrant communities. I hope you enjoy.
Over this time, I found that it's like creativity and like support from others and
to work together to respond to unexpected change and to be able to lean on one another and also have systems that support them.
לרזיליאנס אין תרגום טוב בעברית, אבל רזיליאנס מבחינתי זה לחייך למטופל שאני רואה אחרי תורנות של 25 שעות.
¿Qué es para mí la resiliencia? Es la capacidad de transformar la adversidad en energía y fortaleza.
I would think of resilience as being one of the definitions of architecture. Architecture, after all, is the art of drawing the indeterminacies of life.
The capacity of a system to return to equilibrium after a crisis. We used to live in a stable environment. This is over. Global warming will multiply natural crises. So resilience has become a vital requirement for our city in the future.
It's not a luxury, it's not a maybe, it's a must. It's about survival, our survival as the human race. Mother Earth will survive, but will we? It's about making things right.
I'm still questioning whether our research was ever resilient. That's still, I think, our homework.
To me, the resilience is the capacity to rebound. And a resilient city is a city that learns from one crisis in order to better cope with the next crisis that will necessarily come.
Working together, that's a resilient way of, achieving a goal and looking into the future.
Para mí la resiliencia se encuentra dentro del poder de la gente. Cuando la gente se une para enfrentar un reto, no hay nada que no se puede lograr.
Tools and strategies people develop to survive when mainstream institutions aren't filling that role.
Living in the countryside in osmosis with nature is certainly the best way to overcome life's trials.
What does resilience mean to you?
I always think of resilience as your ability to bounce back from a difficult situation. And it can be to bounce back with health, or if it's a really traumatic situation, then ideally you bounce back with post-traumatic growth.
And many people are struggling both physically and emotionally. Many people feel very fragile. What do you think are the attributes of a resilient person?
Yeah, resilience is something we talk about a lot when we study well-being. People often think about what fosters mental health. Do you have things that make you happy? But also we know that the capacity to share somebody's sadness is important too. In fact, when people are depressed, they actually won't frown as much with somebody else who's telling them something sad. The ability to share somebody's sorrow is a sign that you have a bit extra capacity. Another aspect of resilience is, or of the well-being that can foster resilience, is engaging in things that bring you joy and that just draw your attention and focus into something productive that you can achieve at. That can also be very healthy. Another factor is relationships. Really reaching out to people maybe you haven't talked to in a long time, and renewing old relationships can be a way also to both remember good times, think on good things, and foster resilience.
We are all learning how to use Zoom more effectively during the lockdown. What role do you think communication technology plays, this new ability to connect with people around the world, in fostering personal resilience?
I have close friends, as many people do in other cities, and usually I miss their birthday parties, right? It's like a call or a card. And now it's a group Zoom, or I've actually been sharing, this may sound unhappy, but chemo sessions with a friend who's not allowed to physically have people there at chemo, and she's in another city too. And yet I can pop in and remotely, sit with her and catch up during her chemo session.
How else might technology play a role helping people through these challenging times?
You might know our work with wearables and smartphones. We can monitor subtle changes that are objective over time in your sleep, in your autonomic stress, in your social interaction through the technology with others, and let you know if your behaviors are kind of within a typical range for you, or if they're showing signs that might be something you might want to know about.
But where might this lead in terms of proactively helping people to develop healthier behaviors?
Yeah, Ahino Sakarian in our lab did a doctoral thesis on this, where she identified not just all these complicated measures that machine learning can get that are sometimes kind of black box like in terms of how they contribute to your mental health, but she identified the things you can change. You know, your bedtime, your wake time, how much time you do physical activity, when you're doing it. And then looked at which of those were most associated with tomorrow. Are you calmer or more stressed? Are you happier or are you sadder? Are you healthier or are you sicker? And then enabled people to look at which things they might be able to change that could be associated with tomorrow being happier, calmer, and healthier. And then with that information, you could, in the future, we need more data, but you could get evidence-based nudges or suggestions.
What do you think is the role of trust in developing personal resilience?
I think where we get burned most sometimes is when you trust a person and they let you down. And there's a flip side to it that we need to remember too, and that is forgiveness. So we need forgiveness, tools for restoration, and tools for rebuilding relationships, even when trust has been broken.
And we live in a very stressful time right now. Are you optimistic that we can, as a society, come through this stronger?
So if you're feeling depressed and discouraged by all this horrible stuff going on, think about what are the good things in the world. And if you're having trouble finding them, reach out to us. We'll help you try to think of good things. We see lots of good things that are happening. Just make sure you're opening your eyes and looking for them.
Beautiful. Thank you, Roz Picard. I'm here with Lord Norman Foster, who built one of the great architecture and engineering firms, Foster and Partners, as well as the Norman Foster Foundation. So Norman, perhaps we can start with some of the issues facing us today by looking back in time. You started your practice in the 1960s at a time when young people were focused on the war in Vietnam, civil rights, women's rights, and the environment. So resilience is usually defined as a system that can bend when stressed and not break, or sometimes get stronger, like when you exercise muscles. What do you think is necessary to create a more resilient city?
I think it's the ability of the built environment, the infrastructure, which, if you like, is the urban glue that binds together the individual buildings. So if that infrastructure is adaptable, and the individual buildings are adaptable, then changes of use, changes of work pattern, the ultimate sustainable building is one that can be recycled rather than being demolished. So, so infrastructure and buildings which can adapt to change.
Almost instantly with the lockdown, homes became centers of work as offices were closed, became centers of learning, schools were closed, healthcare, medical offices were closed, exercise gyms were closed. Should we fundamentally rethink how we design the home to accommodate this wider range of activities?
One is obviously by more space, in a traditional sense, let's say more rooms. So you've got the luxury of going to another room, having some privacy, but not everybody can necessarily have that luxury. So that, I think, leads to how you use the space. And I also know some of the research work that you and your unit have been doing in terms of how you use space. And it is possible with the technology that we have at our disposal to be able to reconfigure smaller spaces so that they work better at different times of the day. So we're not talking about static spaces, but we're talking about interactive elements, walls which can move, storage units which can reverse themselves and reveal other work surfaces. But all of this is really about change to improve the quality of life, the quality of living. And that is really at the core what design is about. and learning from the crises, which cyclically, I mean, this will not be in the lifetime of so many people who will be seeing this. This will not be the only crisis that they're going to live through.
How can we make communities more resilient?
So the idea that communities could be much more autonomous is, I think, another big pattern. And again, the pandemic, I think, has hastened this. Trade will continue in some respects to be global, but it will also be more local. So you don't have the kind of Rust Belt consequences of globalization, which impacts the local community. I have to say that if you take the arc of history and you see the progress, notwithstanding the threats which are continuous, then surely you build on the best of the past, and you celebrate those achievements, and you add to that the passion of youth, the ability to be able to improve, to do things, to transform, to challenge, to question. But above all, surely you build on the best of the past.
So Norman, thank you very much for joining us to discuss resilience across scales. So Sandy, as we talk today, the pandemic is raging, revealing tremendous inequities. This period of disruption coincides with the data revolution. How do you think we can make use of this ability to better understand inequality?
The data revolution, which actually is something that was named that by the UN Secretary General, it's new, and we haven't got all the rules down yet, like privacy, just for instance. But one of the things that's true is the data is in too few hands. Google has a lot of data, the government has a lot of data, the NSA has a lot of data, but you and I don't have a lot of data. You need to bring data into the hands of neighborhood groups, of cities, so that they can better understand their situation. And you can diagnose the pandemic as a failure in data sharing. The last time we were here, the Great Depression, we cooked up this thing called GDP. And that measures the amount of money we spend on real things. But it doesn't actually include a lot of the economy today. Moreover, it doesn't include sustainability. It doesn't include inequality. It doesn't include, there's all sorts of stuff it doesn't include. And, generically, this is called ESG measures, right?
From what I can see, the current approach to ESG metrics measures just the internal performance of a company, how much they recycle, their pay equity, things like that. But it does not measure the impact on the community. Will it lead to gentrification or displacement, for example? If we're to build stronger communities, a stronger society, it seems that we must find a way to channel these investments for the public good.
When you invest money, you want to know that you're actually doing what you intended to do, that you improved the neighborhood, that you reduced poverty, whatever. And they know that the current metrics are terrible, but they don't have anything else. And so I think there's a real hunger to develop ways to measure community outcomes as a function of investment. And in fact, that's the thing that we're most excited about. We now have really good ways to predict what sorts of investments will result in greater wealth in a community.
So let's talk about economic systems in the future. The current system, it seems to me, or from one point of view, is based on extraction. A much more resilient system, it seems, would build wealth and keep it in the community.
Communities, to be able to do what you're saying, have to know what the situation is. I mean, these big companies use lots of data to plan, to be able to project, and communities have to be able to be based on knowledge also, if they're going to plot their future. And fortunately, there really is a lot of data that communities can get a hold of. And what we've done is we've worked with legal teams, we've worked with cooperatives and associations of cooperatives to be able to build simple templates that allow communities to be able to come together, pool their data, not give their data up, but to be able to look across people for community needs in a democratic, community-based sort of way, to figure out what sort of investments need to happen, what sort of changes need to happen.
Many communities, Kendall Square, for example, where MIT is located, lack the assets that are needed in daily life. There's no pharmacy, no daycare center, no clothing store, etc. We've been imagining an alternative to static land use regulations that we think of as algorithmic zoning, that would be a process where communities decide on their needs and create dynamic incentives focused on property owners and real estate developers and infrastructure companies to encourage pro-social development. To do this properly, we would need computational law innovations such as smart contracts and public ledgers, self-enforcing systems, and the like. How close do you think we are to actually be able to develop such a system?
Well, there's a couple of different things that are coming that make this plausible. So, for instance, we just helped the Swiss set up something called Swiss Trust Chain, which is for exchange of medical data, real estate data, money, you name it, right? And you see the same thing out of Singapore and other places. These are inherently computational law platforms because they have computational laws about transfers of property, about investment, about transactions. And currently the computations are very simple, right? They would try to make sure it's the right thing. They try to balance tax and things like that. But it's only a very small step to the sort of vision you have about computational zoning. I think, though, that the first thing you have to do is communities have to take control of their assets.
So many of the major assets in a community, a power plant, for example, tend to be either owned by corporations or by governments. It seems that we should put a lot more emphasis on assets that are owned and controlled mutually by a community.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't quite have the statistic, but in the US, I think there's something like $2 trillion a year of financial trade that happens through cooperatives. The largest retail chain in Switzerland is a cooperative. The 56% of all the electric grid in the United States was created by communities, community cooperatives, not the government. We always think grid, that's got to be like government or like these big electric companies. No, it was community cooperatives that did the majority of the surface area of the US. And I think that it's entirely possible that those same sorts of things can deploy internet where it's needed, can deploy other sort of facilities where it's needed, or it's communities coming together to do that.
So working community by community, the city becomes a network of healthy, high-functioning, resilient communities, and the planet becomes a network of resilient cities.
Yeah. Resilience in ecological terms does not demand uniformity. In fact, it's the antithesis of uniformity. So it drives me crazy when people say, we need to make this a national something or other. No, actually, you need a community of learning between communities, a network of cooperation.
Thank you, Sandy.
Okay, well, thank you for putting all this together. It's pretty awesome.
So Mitch, perhaps I could start by asking you for your definition of resilience.
To me, resilience is the ability to adapt and adjust in the face of change. And I think resilience is more important now than ever because we're living in a time of such rapid change and uncertainty and unpredictability. People in today's world are facing a constant stream of unknown and uncertain and unpredictable situations. So they need to be constantly adjusting and adapting. So I think right now, the ability to think and act creatively is more important than ever. That ability to come up with innovative approaches to the unpredictable situations that everybody is confronting.
Well, about adapting, the educational system in this country had to move almost immediately to online learning, and clearly the system was not very prepared to respond to these new circumstances. It was extremely fragile. How did we allow this to happen?
I do think part of the problem is that our education system is still based on a very old model of education and learning. It was developed for the industrial age. It was really based on a delivery model of education, that we deliver information, deliver instruction. And that just doesn't work in a time of rapid change. There's no fixed set of things that are going to last you. It needs to be much more continually adjusting and learning new things over time. Again, I call my research group Lifelong Kindergarten because I think kindergarten gives us a hint as the right way of organizing this. I mean, if you think of the traditional kindergarten, kids are playfully creating things in collaboration with one another. So I think that gets kids off to a resilient start, but that's not the way that the rest of the education system is organized.
Yes, and there are tremendous inequities in education. Affluent families made this transition much more successfully than underprivileged families. How do you think we could begin to correct this?
Yeah, I do think there are clearly huge inequities in society these days, but the inequities are not just in access to technology, though that's part of it, but there's also a huge gap in the approaches for learning. There's this assumption that young people in certain communities need to have just information delivered to them, and that's the only way that they're going to get prepared for the future. And they aren't given the opportunities to design, create, experiment. Like in our group, we started these after-school centers called computer clubhouses, but we knew that access was not enough. There needed to be a different approach. So with these clubhouses, it's not just that we provided technology, but it was for young people from inner city communities would come in and not just use the technology, but learn how to explore, experiment, express themselves with the technology. And we saw that a lot of the young people flourished. Kids who had been unsuccessful in traditional schools flourished in these new settings.
And speaking of flourishing, I spent quite a bit of time in Finland where they have found terrific ways to engage children in new ways. So knowledge transfer largely happens at the home via videos. The classroom time is largely devoted to projects and experiences. And now they're moving towards a distributed model of making use of the resources in the community. The college chemistry lab, the community fab lab, and the like. They largely moving away from school facilities. And by the way, they've largely done away with testing and segregation of classes by age. This seems to point the way to a new model.
Yeah, I definitely, when I think about the direction that education needs to head in the future, I see that we need to break down lots of the structural barriers that exist today. You just mentioned one about the barrier between inside of school and the community. So we need to break that barrier. You should be learning across every place within your community. But there are other barriers as well, the barriers between disciplines. Schools are often divided into math class and language class and history class. So your knowledge gets sort of put into these narrow pillars. Where in fact the most creative learning happens when you cut across the disciplines. I think we also have to break down barriers of time. School days are chunked into these 45-minute periods. And a lot of the projects that are going to be most meaningful take more time. As you start up to work on a project, if you have to shut down 45 minutes later, you're not going to really make progress. So I do think that project-based approach, which breaks down those barriers, is going to be key to be able to have kids prepare for the type of, the needs and the opportunities in tomorrow's society.
How optimistic are you about the prospect of creating a much more aware, enlightened society?
I sometimes say that I'm a short-term pessimist, long-term optimist, because I know it's difficult to bring about these long-term changes. To change the structures in an educational system and to change a media infrastructure, these things aren't easy. We're not going to change them overnight. But I'm a long-term optimist because I do see, glimpses of the possibilities. You see great examples of places that are set up where they are set up to support young people growing up, experimenting, creating, designing, exploring. And you can see the new possibilities there. And you can see that the young people are being prepared better for a society that's in continual change and will value and require creative thinking.
Well, thank you, Mitch, for those words of optimism. I'm here today with Tenzin Priyadarshi, the director of the Center for Ethics here at MIT. So Tenzin, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me. It is a delight.
So I would like to start by getting your thoughts on how we might enable more resilient, equitable communities. But first, what does resilience mean to you?
Resilience, for me, firstly begins with a kind of mental pliancy. And one of the things that I deeply believe is that resilience is something that can be trained.
You say that you can learn resilience. How can an individual train to become more personally resilient? And how can a community learn to be more collectively resilient?
Create little experiments, little practices that allows us to experience more of the wholesome emotional states around joy, a sense of self-esteem, a sense of trust that leads to collaboration and so on. And the more the individuals are able to cultivate emotional resilience, it helps build, again, the capacity and the capability for communities and organizations to build emotional resilience.
We did a workshop a few weeks ago to explore the concept of resilient communities, and the consensus of most groups was that building trust was where we should start. What are your thoughts on how we can increase the level of trust in a community?
One thing is a given, that the progress of civic society can only move as fast and steady as our ability to trust one another. One of the things that we have been seeing with design of certain social media platforms, that it's doing quite contrary to the narrative that was driving it. So the narrative that will bring the world closer, it will connect everybody, and so on. And we are looking at polarization on steroids by virtue of social media platforms. And when we start designing technologies and interventions where it poses a threat to those civic institutions, it's not just disrupting it, but it's threatening it.
So you may be familiar with our Cityscope platform, which is designed to enable a community to explore possibilities for a shared future. The premise is that when you bring people together so they can look each other in the eye, debate alternatives, get feedback related to those alternatives, it creates a far more effective and creative process than with online tools. Do you agree that we should prioritize these in-person interactions?
I do believe so. I think the face-to-face interactions, of this notion of proximity, creates and strengthens empathy at a much higher level than we have been able to sort of foster in online communities. And empathy, with the sense that it creates empathy beyond echo chambers, beyond boundaries of race, religion, gender, and so on.
Okay, well, let's change the topic. The theme of our City Science Summit this year is the power of without. So what does that mean to you?
As a Buddhist monk, there's this wonderful thing about, the paradox of within and without. Right? I think, for me, without implies a sense of freedom. We must begin to decrease our sense of traditional dependencies that we have had thus far, because either those dependencies were not healthy, or they're not going to remain healthy for the well-being of society in the near and long-term future. But the sense of without also, implies, firstly, without boundaries. And so without can imply a lot of things, but for me, it's without boundaries, without biases, which is, I believe, pertinent to this project of flourishing of civic society. I think we are living in an unprecedented time where a lot of these traditional hierarchical models are becoming obsolete.
So Tenzin, do you have any concluding words for our City Science Network from around the world?
I have been heartened by the work I've seen the City Science Lab and the group do over the years in not thinking about design simply in a limited fashion, but thinking of building a more robust civic society and civic institutions by focusing on what's lacking in the interaction of human values and promoting that. And it's not just about the idea that cities are the future, but as we think about the future of cities themselves, one is, of course, the whole spectrum of Internet of Things and connected smart cities. But there are deeper aspects of in this connectivity sense that we don't lose essence of human connectivity and to each other and to the institutions that we build. And so I look forward to all the wonderful ideas that will continue to emerge and be built upon by this wonderful group of people.
Well, thank you so much, Tenzin. It's been a great pleasure to get your thoughts on life, on ethics in the context of cities, and I really appreciate the humanity of your ideas. So, Deb, we have an election next week, and the state of our democracy seems to be very fragile. Society is highly polarized. We're divided largely by our sources of information, our social networks, our belief systems.
Yeah, you're right. We are more divided than ever. I think that is the key, that even more than polarization, that our networks have just become fragmented. And in the extreme, if two groups are just no longer connected, there's no way to build a rough consensus. There is no way to construct an understanding of others that are different than ourselves.
So what should we do to begin to address this situation?
Definitely one part of what I think we need more of, Kent, and what definitely our group is motivated by is creating new spaces, new communication possibilities that do bring people with different perspectives, different lived experiences into contact with one another in a way that's constructive versus destructive. That's where I think some of the real promise is at the level of local communities. You can't choose necessarily who your neighbors are, and your kids go to school with the kids of your neighbors, and they're drinking the same water and they're breathing the same air and dealing with the same shared infrastructure. And when there's a problem with those shared resources, you've got a joint project.
Well, communities often come together for open mic forums that privilege the loudest and angriest voices. Really a terrible process. There's very little nuance.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Done in the wrong way, the loudest voices dominate. And that's probably not a bad way to summarize, in general, the public sphere, our public spaces today. The loudest, most extreme voices dominate. What's the point of tweeting your opinion about something if what you have to say is, well, I'm not really sure, it's kind of complicated, it might be this, it might be that, and no one's going to retweet that. So even if you do put that out there, it's less likely to have impact.
How can these conversations be more fruitful and inclusive so voices that are seldom heard can actually participate?
Well, the art, and perhaps one day the science, of creating, sort of designing environments, designing communication contexts that are really optimized for certain kinds of exchanges to more naturally unfold, where the underheard voices do have an opportunity and incentive to speak up, where there is opportunities to listen and learn and to speak and be heard when you're not used to having those opportunities. The political minority or the introvert, the person who is just doesn't have expertise in some area or policy, but has experienced life as it intersects with those policies.
Are you imagining that we need to come at this from two directions, from the bottom up, building trust in a community and from the top down through regulation?
Well, it depends on regulate. When you say regulate what?
Well, I'm actually thinking specifically about regulating misinformation on Facebook.
Yeah. You know, I think that regulation is going to have a role. In fact, I believe leadership of Facebook has asked for regulation. One of the challenges is that the tools or the instruments that our governments currently have to regulate are very blunt instruments. You know, when I think of the idea of regulation and add the word self in front and say, what about self-regulation? Companies can try to self-regulate, and to some degree, I think many of them are making real efforts, and in some cases making real progress in as human beings. If we have an addiction to a service, we need to learn how to self-regulate, and we might need help. And maybe the most challenging is self-regulation at the level of a group.
So we talked about a lot of the negative aspects, but what is positive about these platforms?
No, there's a lot of power, a lot of possibility, which we rely on every day in these platforms. But what does human flourishing look like in these platforms? What are possibilities that we just have not yet designed? I'm going to go back to the facilitated dialogue as an example. The person who's been trained in facilitating a dialogue, when they work their magic, can create incredible experiences. If you've ever been part of one, I know you have, Kent, and I have as well. You can walk out of a conversation, on cloud nine.
Can these possibilities actually be taken to scale in our society?
Of course they can. Right? I think it's a question of, can we learn from practices of work, translate them into technologies, how do we leverage state-of-the-art AI and digital interaction design and so forth, and how do we bring that together with people who have those intents, who value those kind of interactions. But the ancient social technologies that often are a different realm, can we learn from those and we'll bring them together? If anywhere that's going to happen, Kent, it's at the Media Lab. That's my belief.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Deb Roy.
A resilient urban space should be able to provide room for future upgrades for infrastructures like artificial intelligence and unmanned technologies.
The commercial industry and those delivery men make me more resilient. I love them.
Resilience is the ability to overcome an adversity and still land on your feet.
Resilience is the pursuit of happiness. Is to have a better career and be a better mom. Also be a better version of myself.
Ανθεκτικότητα είναι η αντοχή στα σοκ, η προσαρμοστικότητα, ακόμη και η βελτίωση μετά από την καταπώνηση και χαρακτηρίζει κάθε τι που εξελίσσεται στον χρόνο και παραμένει ζωντανό.
I think for me resilience is about create and looking into the future with different eyes.
To recover fast and strong and adapt to change.
Resilientzia da, erronkei aurre egiteko gaitasuna, ezta? Eguneroko erronka txikienetik erronka kolektibo handietara.
Niretzat erresilientzia malgutasuna da. Aldaketei egokitzeko ahalmena, baino beti ere zure izaera mantenduz.
The ability to bounce back from hardship. And when it comes to the climate, I hope that we don't reach a point that we cannot return from.
Resilience is just a lot about focus and making sure you're focusing on the things that you can change and you can affect.
قدرة أي نظام حضاري مع سكانه للحفاظ على الاستمرارية خلال جميع الصعوبات والضغوط مع التكيف بشكل إيجابي والتحول نحو الاستدامة. منعه resilience.
Resilience is the acceptance of, unlearn and relearn the new reality.
Sustainability over time, but with the ability to evolve in the face of various dynamic and crisis processes.
Resilience means opportunity, a new opportunity to reflect, to think and make things in a better way.
There are no quick fixes. You see, complex problems have simple, quick, easy to understand, wrong answers. So we have to be realistic, patient, persistent, and disciplined. We must follow evidence.
I would like to now bring in four of the people that we just heard from. First, Rosalind Picard. Roz is Director of Effective Computing here at the MIT Media Lab. Welcome, Roz. And Deb Roy. Deb directs the Laboratory for Social Machines, and for the past year has served as the executive director of the Media Lab. Hi, Deb. And Alex Pentland. Sandy directs both the Human Dynamics Group here at the lab and MIT Connection Science, an MIT-wide initiative. Welcome, Sandy. And finally, Mitchell Resnick. Mitch is director of Lifelong Kindergarten here at the lab. Hi, Mitch. In conversations with all of you, issues related to community came up. As we begin to think about possible research related to resilience across scales, perhaps I could ask each of you if you believe that a focus on the scale of the local community or neighborhood is where we should start. And if not, where would you start?
Yeah, my work starts on the level of a community, and there's a number of reasons. One is that we have a segregated society, so there are communities that need to do better, and society needs to give them the opportunity to do better. That's one thing. The second thing is that trust in all of the things that we've seen comes from people who shared same sorts of outcomes, so same medical, same schooling, same things, and work on it together. So it's not like Facebook communities. It's like face-to-face things where there's a lot of your life, a lot of the outcomes that are shared. And when you work together on those, you build trust. That's what's lacking to a large degree in our society is we don't know our neighbors, we don't work with them. And a lot of this is the fact that we've tried to build these global platforms that replace the local human-human interaction.
I think what Sandy said is really interesting, and also what Tenzin said too, that the community starts with individuals. And I wish we could just like do a show of hands. How many people know their neighbors, talk to their neighbors more than once a week, you know, get out and meet the people in their community, welcome new neighbors. And, you know, we have 500 friends on social media or more, but a lot of people don't know the person next door.
Absolutely.
Well, first, certainly I want to tease apart community in several different ways. One thing I strongly agree with is the importance of focusing on community rather than just the individual. When we think about learning and education, a lot has been focused on a very individualistic approach. And actually here in the United States, there's a very individualistic approach to many aspects of the culture. So I do think focusing more on how we sort of connect with others, learn with and from others, collaborate with others, share with others is a central part of both learning and all aspects. I guess where I have a little, and I do think small community is important. People are overwhelmed when they get lost in a big city. And there's undoubtedly powerful things about face-to-face, next-door interactions. But I also think there can be a real power of small community, of connecting with people at a distance who have shared interests and shared passions and shared hobbies. So I don't want to overlook that. So yes, small community, not just the individual, but I think there can be different ways of forming small communities.
So I had a very interesting conversation with, I think, with Norman Foster about infrastructure and ways to make it more resilient. And one way is to move from centralized systems to more distributed, lightweight systems. And so maybe, Sandy, do you think that the future of legal systems and economies, data networks, is more of a distributed model?
Well, the systems that I see coming up, and I run a group that's called law.mit.edu. It's law schools around the world working on computation. The focus is on having much more dynamic, adaptive law. It's going to be more computational. And the question is how do you keep community at the center of that? And how do you build law that can be adopted by other communities very rapidly when it shows that it's a good idea and changed when it shows that it's a bad idea? So it's very much in this biological resilience applied to the concept of law. which is all too often, somebody from above said, this is it forever. Actually, that's a very poor strategy for resilience.
Maybe I want to chime in there.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I did think when mentioning distributed, decentralized, as I listened to all 6 of those interviews, that did seem to me like one of the most important themes that stretched through those interviews. Despite in all these different thematic areas and all the different scales, there was this emphasis of the value and the power of decentralized, distributed approaches, of building on local knowledge and local expertise. We certainly see that in our own work. There's not going to be one single uniform answer that works for everybody, that just gets applied in this uniform way globally. That it is important to build on the specific expertise and the knowledge. We see that when we work with individual young people or people in different communities and neighborhoods, make sure to build on the local knowledge and local expertise is such an important part.
Yeah, when I think about social media platforms, it's a perfect place to take Mitch's comment and apply it. Who has the authority to decide who's on the platform? Just kind of authorization of identity. Right now, the standard answer is it's centralized. Whoever runs the platform has the authority to allow people on. But it seems like decentralized authority may be a much more effective way to scale these networks. Similarly, content moderation, which has become the bane of these platforms' existence. If you're running YouTube or Facebook, you've got armies of people trying to moderate. And the problem is that there is, for each different community, a different set of norms. And, if you come into my home, I'll expect you to take your shoes off. If I go to yours, you might have different norms. Those abilities to, in nuanced ways, have the right standards for different communities. It seems, again, centralization is one of the bugs in the system today, and decentralization could really open up new possibilities.
And Roz, it seems that medicine and health and wellness is becoming increasingly decentralized. Telemedicine, sensors worn on the body. Is that the future?
That's the present, especially with the pandemic. Finally, the doctors are online, right? This has moved, much faster now. We work with a lot of psychiatrists at Mass General Hospital, and they're, finally meeting with all the patients online. And the pandemic, psychiatry is growing like crazy, and this is something that destigmatizes it, makes it a lot easier for people to get help by just setting up a chat.
Well, another topic that came up in, I think, all of our conversations was trust. And I know Sandy mentioned that the countries that have a high level of trust seem to have fared the best with the pandemic. And in fact, some of those voices were from Taiwan, where we do a lot of work. The US would only have 100 deaths rather than 226,000 if we had the same per capita mortality rate in the US as Taiwan. And there's a very high level of trust. But I'm wondering, can building trust be a research focus?
We do large-scale experiments, both at the community and even at the national level, where we get people to try different things. And what's striking is the experiments we've done, sort of community level things. Everybody part of the platform it's the repeated mutual communication, which is evidence that you're doing something that's valuable to both parties, that best predicts people's trust actions. So if you want to know, will they watch your baby? Will they loan you your car? You can look at the pattern of communication between people and figure that out. And face-to-face is most important. Voice is next, then comes the email and things like that. But it all contributes to building this web of, oh, they've got my back. That's trust. Trust is not reliability. Reliability is good, but it's, do they have my back?
The idea of trust came up in our earlier interview, Ken, I talked about this network of after-school centers, computer clubhouses that our group had started. And as we started them, my longtime collaborator, Natalie Rusk, came up with one of the guiding principles was that we needed to cultivate an environment of respect and trust. And a lot of times people misinterpreted that. They thought it meant, oh, you're just helping kids learn to be nice to one another. And of course, that's good. But for us, it went deeper. For us, trust meant the kids would feel comfortable taking the risks that are necessary to try new things, to experiment, to be able to do creative things. If you're going to do creative things, if you're going to be resilient, you need to be able to take risks, try new things. And you're not going to do that if you're in an environment where you're not trusted, if someone is going to ridicule you or cause problems if something goes wrong. So building that trust is so important in a learning environment.
I was just going to say, in some of our work, Kent, trust is a pretty central concept. For example, we're working with a group of partners in Atlanta, in Georgia, in developing a public health communication network. And a lot of our focus of our research is to use a combination of analytics and on-the-ground knowledge to identify what we call trusted influencers who already have credibility and connection with people in the community. We're actually working in neighborhoods south of I-20 in Atlanta, which are predominantly African-American communities, where the level of trust with some of the public health agencies and we might turn to certain sources for reliable information and guidance, and those links are not as strong in these communities, but there are trusted, credible influencers. So kind of mapping those networks of trust, finding those individuals, recruiting them into a communication network that has a decentralized dimension to it. Those are elements of an active research project. So just to answer your question, can trust be a focus of research at the Media Lab? Yes, I think that work is one example of exactly that.
So these influencers already have trust in the community. So the goal with your work is to build trust with the influencer, and then it propagates and can be scaled.
That's right, trust. And there's also a question of trust in what domain. And so you might have someone who has the reach, but is not necessarily going to be listened to or credible in one domain versus another. And also there are individuals who really have their ear to the ground. And if a certain message is not resonating or misinformation is circulating, certain people who may be able to inform on that front as well. So these are people who have established connections already. And again, it takes us back to local. Where are the most likely people? And I think to Mitch's point, there's different ways to think of local. It's not necessarily geographic, but somehow these kind of tightly knit communities, where there's both strength and resilience within the communities, but also, the flip side of the coin, which we've talked about in our conversation, fragmentation, that the tendency to also disconnect from those other groups. So, how do we, in cases where there is a need for shared understanding, shared common ground on like the science of COVID as a perfect example, weaving networks of trust back together where fragmentation has done damage, I think is a really important focus of research.
Something that Deb just said, and Mitch also, which is these sort of distance communities. So today, for instance, in my research group, we have distance community. Oh, I'm sorry. This is Alexa talking to me. So in our research, we have these distance relationships, and that works really well. Okay, but onboarding people, getting new members of the community, is nearly impossible. And that, I think, is this notion of sort of shared value, shared outcome. We're all people on the same bus, basically, right? And it's very, so distance things are good, but it's very hard to build that sense of common outcome of shared dependence on each other, except around narrow topics where it's fairly patterned and the outcomes are clear. So I think that's a mistake people make also, is that they say, oh, just because you have lots of communication, it doesn't actually mean that you have shared values across a whole area, but only necessarily in smaller areas, possibly.
One of the things Sandy's making me think of is all the ways we build trust when we're not actually talking to each other. When you just walk by and you see somebody sitting there quietly working, or you see somebody just doing something nice for somebody just because. It's all the things people do when they don't think they're being watched. And that's something that we're missing right now, because we're pretty much only seeing each other when we're, flipping on the camera and knowing that we're being watched. So, and we feel a little creeped out by a camera just spying on us all the time in our home. So there's this full bandwidth ability to see and be seen, to know and be known, that I think precedes a lot of real trust building when you're not, quote, on camera. And that's missing right now. So I think it is harder to build that kind of trust.
Maybe you can help me with this question. It's kind of difficult, but if we were to address resilience in a comprehensive way at the three scales we're talking about, people, community, society, that's a huge, huge undertaking. I mean, way beyond the capability of a single lab or even MIT as a whole. So clearly we need to focus, and the best work at the Media Lab is about making connections between disciplines. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on how we might focus research ideas that plays to the strengths of the lab, that makes connections between disciplines and connections between people and group. Maybe Deb, start with you, since you're the executive director of the Media Lab.
No, dear. It's no accident the Media Lab is part of the School of Architecture, and to at the same time keep in view what the experience of the individual is and the affordance of a built environment, but also understand how buildings fit together and at different scales, to understand the urban scales all the way down to configurations of specific rooms, sort of thinking about the equivalent span of kind of units of analysis that, I think to your point, there is no one correct unit of analysis thinking about the individual, the group, the community, and the species, that we have to have the ability to move between levels, do deep work at one level, but then make sure you're contextualizing and drawing connections to others. So I think one of the interesting things about the Media Lab as a whole is that at any given moment, we have hundreds of projects, research projects, that are thinking about the intersection of humans and technology, and moving across those different scales. So, just in my own work, we're sometimes designing tools for individuals, but typically these are communication tools. So we're also looking at patterns of communication and connection at the group and higher level. I have seen this as a real area of weakness where, we sometimes in our group talk about micro versus macro. If you're talking about social media platforms, we think a lot about these, that a lot of the analyses are either done at what's wrong with this platform, or how do we police the behavior or influence the behavior of the individual. And then that sort of meso level scale of group interactions is often overlooked. So I think that there's a lot that it matters in the middle. And it tends to be the blind spot in my experience.
I guess my mind is drawn to process that I think is important at all scales. When we think about the work that we do in our group, we want to support what we call creative learning process. And we think of it as a spiraling process where it starts with the imagination. You come up with an idea, you create something, a prototype with it. You experiment and play with that to explore it. You share with others, get feedback. you reflect upon your observations and your conversations, and that sparks new ideas, and you keep spiraling with that. So that type of iterative approach is so important at all levels. The individual, I think that's how we make the greatest progress. At the research group level, at the media lab level, at all different levels, this type of iterative, creative approach, which is very different than sometimes people feel that, well, to be a good problem solver, you analyze, come up with a plan, execute, and you're done. And I think that gets in the way at all levels. So at all levels to be thinking about, and I do think that connecting with Deb's point, it is something that grows out of the spirit of the school of architecture and tradition of architecture, of this design process, of this creative spiral of continual experimenting and expressing, I think is something that's going to be important for creativity and resilience at all levels.
Well, I would steal a phrase from Mitch, talk about learning communities. How do you get communities of trust that learn from each other to explore lots of versions of reality in parallel, right? How do they learn from each other? How do they construct a better way to living in this sort of distributed fashion? And so perhaps resilient learning would be the theme.
And Roz?
I think I would bring together children from very different backgrounds across socioeconomic status and racial boundaries and political boundaries, where they are, where there's a history of division, and try to build friendships among the next generation, teach them each other's songs, and encourage and support those friendships to grow as they grow older.
Okay, we are out of time, and I would like to thank Roz, Deb, Sandy, and Mitch for beginning this conversation about resilience across scales.